acting CEO of NSFAS, Waseem Carrim, told Parliament last week that while sometimes people think that NSFAS is just a youth program, but you can be any age to apply for NSFAS. This comment comes after Parliament was told that NSFAS granted a 7-year-old a bursary. Now, at least 612 of the 766,000 students who've applied for the financial aid in 2026 were 50 years and older, while 4,529 were between 40 and 50 years. Well, we're joined now by Waseem, the acting CEO of NSFAS, to get more clarity on this. Waseem, good to have you, by the way. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Thabo. Good afternoon to you and your viewers.
There are some experts who have looked at this thing and say it's quite puzzling that you would still be spending so much money on people who are not going to be productive and, well, not going to be contributing to the economy anymore because of their age. They say that this is actually wasteful expenditure and should not happen. What's the thinking around not having an age limit?
Yes, thanks, Thabo. So I think NSFAS was set up with a primary mandate of providing students from working class, underprivileged, marginalized, vulnerable backgrounds in being able to access higher education. The Constitution of South Africa guarantees everybody the right to basic education and says the state shall, through progressive means, make higher education available. It doesn't say we shall make higher education available to only young people. Of course, South Africa does face an acute youth development and youth unemployment issue, which means that 99% of NSFAS's funding does go to young people in their teenage years, in their 20s, and in their early 30s. But we do have a small proportion of beneficiaries who are in their 40s, 50s, and in the very isolated case, one person in their 70s as well. And let me say, Thabo, NSFAS unequivocally supports that all people apply. It's not a policy decision that we think will be changing anytime soon, because I think we know the history that South Africa comes from. We know the history where a large amount of people were denied access to opportunities, economic and education opportunities. And if we can play a role in transformation and in offering people the opportunity to pursue higher education at any age, I think it's a very progressive way to go about the work that we do. I think it also sends a very message to society that you can pursue education at any age. And I really do think some of these stories are quite inspirational in their nature.
So considering, one, the funding shortfall, two, the high demand in terms of the number of students who qualify to go to university that require financial aid, is it not time for you to relook at your eligibility criteria?
I think NSFAS as a scheme comprehensively needs to look at its sustainability as an organization, right? And what do I mean by that is that, of course, over a number of years, we've seen as a result of an increased number of bachelor passes at basic education, as a result of a cost of living crisis in South Africa, as a result of declining state resources in real time, that we have seen that demand exceeds the available resources that we can provide. I almost guarantee you that if you were to cut all the over 35s out of the fund, that would not even tickle the budget deficit that you face on an annual basis. You need much more progressive reform outside of that. And if you read the most recent cabinet statement that was issued for the cabinet meeting on the 5th of December, you'll see that cabinet approved that NSFAS starts a consultation process with the Department of Higher Education and Training on a more sustainable funding and financing mechanism for the higher education sector. So we fully agree that this is a space where reform is required. What we don't think is that cutting over 50s will make any difference in achieving sustainability. Yeah.
So currently, how do you then weigh that means test or that ability for a 70-year-old to be able to qualify? I mean, do you still look at the same things, home ownership, whether they have a combined household salary of 350,000? How does it work in that instance?
Yeah, so NSFAS looks at two things in particular. One is financial eligibility. So our policies guide us in saying that if you come from a household which has an income below 350,000, now of course for for young people, we're mostly assessing their parental income. If applicants indicate to us that they are not dependent on parents, then we assess their income individually. But then the other case is that you have to meet academic eligibility, right? So you have to be accepted at an institution of higher learning in South Africa. And in addition to that, you must meet the academic progression criteria required. So those are the factors we look at. Of course, as we assess sustainability of the fund, looking at how we assess income assets is something that's important to us. A big conversation that we're having is that, a household might be above 350,000. It might have 3 children in university at the same time, and that household is under sustained stress. And I think a big question that we need to answer for the future is how do we ensure that every deserving young person in the country who does not have financial means can access higher education in the country.
So how is it not then, in your words, a waste of national resource? So how would a 70-year-old be able to be a contributor as opposed to the well-being and vibrancy of our economy at that particular age, which many view as an age of retirement?
So let's leave the 70-year-old out of it, right? Because I think that's one person. So let's take the over 50. So we've got this year NSFAS funded about 1,000 beneficiaries who are over the age of 50. Let's take into account that if you're 55 this year, you would have been born in the year 1970, right? Which means that you may have missed the opportunity to be able to access education because we would have been living under apartheid when you most likely finished your matric here, right? And you may have had talents and skills to be able to contribute here, yeah? And maybe at your advanced age, you decide that higher education is something that you want to pursue. I would argue that the state has an obligation to be able to assist you, right? Because I also think that we think about higher education purely from an economic terms, right? I think it has other benefits in terms of social growth. It has benefits in terms of productivity. It has benefits in terms of learning and motivation to others. And I think when we solely look at items from a purely economic perspective is when we lose sight of what we're supposed to achieve as society. The state is not fundamentally set up to pursue only economic gains. It's also there to pursue social gains here. Yeah? And I think that's very important consideration in how we design and implement programs of government in the country.
Return on investment, though, you're still not giving me fully, an understanding of how does a nation then get return on that investment?
I think that a nation gets return on investment because some people do still have ability to contribute productively to the economy, right? I do think in that way, a 55-year-old still has 10 years left in the workforce, for example, yeah, right? But I think we're still looking at education purely from a commodity perspective then, right? I don't think we're looking at it from a social perspective here. And I think if the state was to only measure everything in terms of return on investment, for example, why do we celebrate national days in the country here, right? You can argue it doesn't really provide a return on investment. People will argue it's a wastage of resources, but we protect our heritage and our culture. That's the fundamental argument with sports, arts, and culture, for example, right? So I think, yes, economic and investment returns are critically important, but it's not the only assessment we should be making in these decisions that we make.
Waseem Carrim, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. That's the NSFAS acting CEO. They're responding to that current debate on the age limit of those who qualify to get access to the NSFAS scheme, considering the demand, considering the limitation on resources. Well,